Welcome to Commander's Tech, Weapons and Warfare in Context. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a very influential book in both tactics and in military history. It's famous for its content, but probably more so for its author. Infantry Attacks by Erwin Rommel. He wrote the book prior to World War II, and it was published in 1937, quickly translated into several other languages, and it became recommended reading for officers in many armies, including in the U.S. Army. Rommel had been a junior officer during World War I, and he fought on most of the major German fronts, although not necessarily at the biggest battles. The book is a combination of war memoir and an analysis or lessons learned from the different engagements that Rommel experienced during the war. The book is particularly interesting for the perspective it gives on late 19th and early 20th century combat in World War I, which differs in some material ways from popular perceptions of the war, with a matter-of-fact description of the events, as this book is not meant as a political or social statement, but as a cold review and analysis of tactical and strategic operations. Rommel joined the German army in 1911, and by the start of the war, he was the equivalent of a second lieutenant. He commanded infantry platoons in eastern France, and at the start of the invasion, he was with the 124th Infantry, which was the 6th Württembergish Infantry. At the start, it was a mobile war. The trench warfare that typified the Franco-Belgian front had not yet begun. Instead, it was more like late 19th century warfare, with skirmishing infantry maneuvering through forests and villages and farms, making use of cover, digging shallow trenches and foxholes, but not yet the complex trench warfare of later on. These were temporary trenches that were only briefly used. Rommel was an aggressive commander, and he often led from the front. As the war transitioned to static trench warfare, Rommel led his forces in the Ardennes, not so far from Verdun, but this was some time before the horrific Battle of Verdun, at which Rommel was not present. After being wounded, but also promoted and decorated for his audacity and his tactical skill in the Ardennes, he was sent to lead troops in the High Vosges, a mountain range in eastern France, where the trench warfare persisted, but not at the same level of ferocity as in the lower country. From there, he was withdrawn from the French theater, and he led mountain infantry in the Alpencorps against Romanian and Russian forces in the Carpathians, and subsequently against Italian forces in the Alps around Austria. Following his descriptions of the action, Rommel provides an observations or lessons learned section, presenting takeaways for officers and soldiers in the field to take into consideration. Examples include, the winner of a man-to-man fight is the man with one more bullet left in his magazine. This came about after Rommel, while leading from the front early in the war, picked up a rifle to engage a lone French soldier. Now, a recurring problem for soldiers on both sides, particularly early in the war, was their rifles firing too high. This was because the sights were calibrated for much greater distances than engagements were actually occurring at. So, Rommel and the French soldier exchanged fire until they were both out of ammunition. Now, more of Rommel's men arrived at this point, so he survived the engagement, but running out of ammunition like that could have been a disaster. Another lesson, following a temporarily successful trench assault in the Ardennes, was don't get too far ahead of your supply lines, or you risk losing your gains. Rommel led a very successful assault on French trenches, where they overran their objective, advancing several hundred yards and clearing the French lines. But they got too far ahead of the German main force. Rommel's company attempted to fortify and hold the captured positions against increasingly fierce French counterattacks, but ultimately they ran low on ammunition and other supplies. There was no safe route for resupply, so they were forced to fall back to the German lines. A third lesson, coming from his experience leading the Württemberg Mountain Battalion in Romania, is to be properly prepared for your environment. In the high mountain positions to which they were initially deployed, the cold, the snow, the rain, and the fog was a greater threat to his men than the Romanians were when they arrived in position without proper winter gear. Much of his force was initially incapacitated by frostbite and hypothermia, and the available wood was too wet from the rain to build warming fires. For me, as a modern reader, I had a number of takeaways, both regarding the tactics as well as the realities of late 19th and early 20th century warfare. First, communication is essential. Rommel's men early in the war got shelled by their own artillery after taking a French position, which had been identified some hours earlier by a cavalry patrol. By the time the French position was reported to the artillery and the bombardment began, Rommel's men had overrun that French position and were beginning to fortify it themselves. And there was no way to communicate that back to the artillery to stop the bombardment. That brings up the second observation. 19th and early 20th century warfare was nearly blind. While they had radio and aircraft, wireless units for radio were too heavy and too bulky and too fragile to take out on the front lines with the men, while wired telephone connections, were also pretty fragile, and they would have to continuously repair them. In fact, that's something that happened all through the war. But the result of that was that communication back with command was accomplished mostly using runners. Other takeaways for me included how much time was spent digging trenches and dugouts. Rommel repeatedly emphasizes that the spade is as important as the rifle. Battle was often met at very short ranges compared to what was planned for. The trench lines were often less than 200 yards apart and sometimes as little as 40. Weapons had been designed for much longer distances. The rifles were zeroed for 400 yards to be used for effective volley fire at 1,000, were far less accurate at actual combat distances. For this reason, as well as the protection of the trenches, high-angle indirect fire was critical. The key weapons were mortars and heavy trench mortars, which Rommel refers to as mine throwers. They're the key weapons, along with hand grenades. Casualties were lower than the modern perception of World War I, but there were a steady attrition, and most of the casualties were from artillery. Rommel is able to repeatedly move his men across no man's land without incident, because they carefully rehearse before an assault, and they move quietly without shooting until they are at their objective. The book is fairly readily available online from a variety of publishers, because it is in the public domain. Still, the book is very interesting to both students of military history and of modern warfare, as it gives a clear, rational presentation of the First World War from someone who was there and who understood both the small picture, that is, life and action on the front, and the big picture, which is the strategic operations. This is one of the clearer illustrations that I've seen of how warfare is essentially personal combat writ on a larger scale.